Live yet. I was like just getting nervous. All right. Hello and welcome to our group. Okay. So we will be discussing functional behavior assessments and experimental functional analysis, the benefits of each, the disadvantages of each, and it will begin with Kristen discussing the advantages of functional behavior assessments, followed by me, Latanya, discussing the advantages of experimental functional analysis. Then, oh my goodness, why can't I talk? Then Harley will be discussing the disadvantages of experimental functional analysis, and Cara will follow up with the disadvantages of functional behavior assessments. And then we will have our conclusion. So to begin, let's start with Kristen.
Thank you. So I am the stator for the functional behavior assessment, and I wanted to first explain functional behavior assessment. So it is a tool that is used to look at behavior and describe what the target behavior is, or the behavior that you're trying to stop or replace. And the functional behavior assessments can be defined the behavior in terms of qualitative and quantitative terms. Additionally, we will look at the events that lead up to the behavior and also the events that come after the behavior that will be reinforcing it. Functional behavior assessment has two different methods. There is the indirect method, which is a lot of reviews, recordings, rating scales, interviews, things like that. And I have a few a few examples, if I can share this. So one of the examples is the problem behavior questionnaire. And so it looks a little bit like this. This is something that you would give to the parent or caregiver of the client that you are assessing. Another example is, this is a continuation of the PBQ, and then we have an analysis of it. So it would be put into this graph type form so that you can analyze and see what kind of results you got. There are 4 different functions of behavior at the most basic level, and this would be able to tell you what the guardian or caregiver assumed the behavior's function was. Additionally, we have the functional analysis screening tool, which is FAST. So this is another parent-caregiver interview questionnaire. And then we have the questions about behavioral function. All of these would most likely be given in interview form. And a second type of assessment that is prominent in functional behavior assessment is direct assessments. And this form is a type of direct assessment. It is a behavior data sheet. What this would look like is you would have the date, you would have, this is an individualized sheet, so it has like tantrum and it's already predefined tantrum. This would be something that you would actually use after a functional behavior assessment has already assumed what the function of the behavior was. But it's kind of similar because you would still have the date, you would still have the duration of the behavior, but a behavior data sheet that you would use in a functional behavior assessment would have an antecedent space where you would write the events leading up to the behavior, a behavior space where you would specifically describe what behaviors the client engaged in, and it would have a consequences space where you would say what happened after their behavior, how did the parent react, the teacher react, whoever the guardian at that time may be, so that you could put all of the data together and analyze it. Okay, and that is, how do I exit? And that is the examples that I have of functional behavior assessment. And now I want to point out the advantages of functional behavior assessment. There are plenty of advantages. The first being that they're easily taught. In one study that we discussed as we were researching, the researchers on this study, Alter, Conroy, Mansell, and Hayden, discussed that the way that you approach functional behavior assessment, or either type of assessment, should be better suited to people or teachers in the school system, because it would allow them to adapt it and allow them to use it in the classroom more easily. And I feel like the functional behavior assessment would be easier to do because the ABC data forms and some of the other direct methods are methods that can be used and adapted to the classroom needs. The form I just showed you was one that was a narrative, but there's also a checklist form, so that if the teacher wasn't entirely sure what the antecedents might have been, or if what the consequences might have been, there are pre-filled antecedents, like something was removed, something the client was told no, that they can't have an item, and things like that, so that it's more clear what exactly happened. Additionally, these assessments are less time consuming. They might take between 15 to 20-minute observations, and it might take 4 or 5 observations for you to get a steady baseline. They are also cost-effective. They allow for less consultant time on site because they're so easily adaptable, and because the teacher can, set up what the target behaviors are, and it can be adapted to the classroom. The advantages of the indirect assessment would be that they provide qualitative information, and it can lead to the discovery of the origin of the behavior, or the functions of the behavior, as far as things that you haven't necessarily observed yet, but it might give you a clue as to what you definitely need to be looking for. And also, scales and questionnaires are more standardized, so they're easier to measure. Additionally, direct assessments have an accurate correlation between the function of the behavior and what is actually proven to be the function of the behavior. They can be, like I said, performed quickly, and they are trainable. So that is our advantages for functional behavior assessment.
Thank you, Kristen. I am unmuted. Okay, so the benefits, moving along, the advantages of experimental function analysis are as follows. Bear with me one moment. So an experimental function analysis is a specific and structured assessment method, and it is more advantageous because it allows for the direct manipulation of antecedents in order to provoke the desired behavior. EFAs begin with a theoretical deduction rather than empirical observation, and the deductions are almost always formed from the description of functional behavior assessments, i.e. the interviews and the questionnaires by parent givers. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll deduct a hypothesis, deduct a hypothesis, and from there we can know how to manipulate the environment based on the hypothesis from the direct functional behavior assessments. So After gathering the data from the descriptive FBAs, we form a hypothesis of the target behavior, and then we begin the experimental function analysis, and then we'll manipulate the environment to test and support previous hypotheses. To ensure validity, EFAs begins with a baseline measurement prior to any change in specific variables. So, and each variable is manipulated independently of other variables. And this just strengthens the validity and reliability of EFAs. Another benefit is that you don't have to wait for the behavior to occur naturally like you would in the FBA. So we have already hypotheses. And so we can go in directly from there and start, as I stated before, just start changing things instead of in a natural environment, just waiting for the behavior to occur or hoping the behavior occur. And because we are directly manipulating it ourselves, we are able to avoid other confounding variables that may occur naturally during a functional behavioral assessment. So directly manipulating the environment provides more information on the functions and causations of the behavior. It involves more tailored research into the target behavior because you are systematically manipulating the variables around it. You have to be well versed on what that target behavior is and everything that occurs with it in order to know how to manipulate things around it to provoke it. So by being the sole person to intentionally bring about a behavior, you're able to see firsthand what causes it. In so many ways, you're sort of taking the guesswork out of finding the root cause of the problem or target behavior. Another advantage of experimental function analysis is their accuracy. The results of EFAs were proven to be over 95% accurate in a 1994 literature review by Iwata, Dorsey, and et al. In a more recent meta-analysis, Hanley, conducted by Hanley, EFAs yielded 95.7% accuracy in over 277 articles. The results of EFAs are so accurate that they predict not only whether a behavior is attention-seeking, but what type of attention that client is seeking. So in a recent study in the education and treatment of children, Howard Mills and Emily Schulmate describe a classroom-based EFA that was conducted with 2 third-grade children, who engaged in disruptive and off-task behaviors. According to the authors, the EFA made it possible to distinguish between what kind of teacher attention was reinforcing for the child, positive or negative attention. So more accurate information of function behaviors sets up the BCBA to create more precise treatments, which in turn is more effective for the client. And as we know, effective treatment is in compliance with Code 2.09a, and it also leads to longer lasting treatments. More effective treatments lead to longer lasting treatments. EFA's reliability to identify the variables that relate to problematic behaviors is considered the gold standard for assessing behaviors in the entire behavior analytic community. Function analysis do this by targeting the conditions and consequences that surround the behavior. In a 2013 experiment conducted by Bowman, Hardesty, Mendesmith, even in the presence of other complex variables, an effective treatment plan was still produced based on EFA's ability to specifically single out and ultimately avoid confounding variables. So along with their reliability and accuracy, experimental function analyses are also unbiased. They are based on a direct observation of the behavior rather than surveys and descriptive analogs. Summarize, EFAs allow for direct and quantifiable observation of behavior, manipulation, and control of environmental conditions. They provide information on the functional properties and relationships. They are highly effective, have good reliability and validity, and are flexible and can be individualized, and their outcomes lead to strategies for interventions. So EFAs have long been, and in my opinion, will continue to be the best assessment tool for determining the functions of behaviors. And that is it for me.
Okay, I am here to attack experimental functional analyses. So one disadvantage to experimental functional analyses is that the process of conducting such assessments are time-consuming. Multiple articles have shown that assessment conditions are divided into multiple parts, each of which can last between 5 and 15 minutes long, making for an assessment that lasts anywhere between 25 to 75 minutes. At times, it may be deemed necessary for the student to repeat some of the assessment conditions, as well, further prolonging the process. Alter, Contra, Mansell, and Hayden in a 2008 article described 5 conditions, each lasting 5 minutes, which were employed during the functional analysis phase, as phase 1 being a tangible item, phase 2 being attention, phase 3, escape or avoidance, phase 4, ignorance, and phase 5, free play or control. During this functional analysis demonstration, there were 1 to 2 minute breaks between each condition in order to review the details in the next condition with the teacher and to set up necessary materials. According to a 2013 study conducted by Beavers, Iwata, and Lerman, the majority of studies included full functional analyses in which subjects were exposed to assessment conditions 3 or more times. In both present review and combined studies, 10-minute sessions were used nearly 50% of the time, as well as sessions as little as 5 minutes and as high as 15 were used for the remaining half. The second disadvantage to experimental functional analysis is that the process of implementation is costly. In a 2017 article by Wenzel, observational functional assessments are more resource intensive than direct functional assessment. Another disadvantage of experimental functional analysis is that these analyses may also be intrusive. Experimental functional analyses require an experimental environment and usually cannot be conducted within the classroom setting. These types of functional analyses also demand different assessment conditions that may not create the same results as a natural setting. The process of experimental functional analyses often requires further reinforcement of maladaptive behaviors, which can be particularly dangerous in cases of violent behaviors. Beavers et al. 2013 described the process of a functional analysis as being designed to evoke problem behavior and suggest that it is unclear whether the increase in the responding observed in one or more conditions of an experimental functional analysis poses greater risk than that observed outside of the assessment session, or greater than the risk posed by foregoing a functional analysis altogether. According to Herzinger and Campbell, 2007, throughout the process of the experimental functional analysis, researchers are collecting data within non-naturalistic environments, intentionally increasing life-threatening maladaptive behaviors. This is because when treatment follows exposure to functional analyses in which behaviors contact continuous reinforcement, the behavior may increase or strengthen in frequency, magnitude, or intensity. This goes to show that with experimental functional analyses, there's a great risk being posed to the client where self-injurious behavior or physically aggressive behavior may be continuously reinforced just to determine the function of the behavior. And that does not mean that just because a function is determined for a specific setting that has been contrived, that the same behaviors serve the same function outside of that particular environment. So this was my argument against experimental functional analysis.
At this point, I will be attacking the functional behavior assessments. First off, before I go into the disadvantages of the indirect assessment, as well as the disadvantages of the direct assessment. I am going to go over some disadvantages that can be seen with the descriptive FBAs in general. So first off, both methods have shown inconsistent results. Lewis et al. In their 2015 study claimed that descriptive FBAs had internal validities and predicted similar, if not identical, functions of behavior as did the experimental functional analysis, but they glossed over the fact that in most cases, the descriptive behavior assessments only provided information about a secondary or possibly part of a primary function of behavior and failed to identify the complete picture of the functions of behavior. Without the full picture of the functions of behavior, how can we expect the subsequent treatment to be effective? And the confounding variables that EFA typically is able to counteract often will cause issues in a descriptive FBA in such forms that the variables may affect the responses given in particularly indirect assessments. And also, the descriptive FBAs do not allow for the manipulation of the environmental variables. So in most cases, all the environmental variables that are causing changes in the behavior are still in effect throughout conditions and observation periods and would further confound the results in studies. In addition, the descriptive assessments are stated by Herzinger and Campbell in their 2007 study to be completely ineffective in identifying distant antecedent events that would affect the behavior and cause significant changes in behavior. In terms of how the setting events would provide antecedent stimuli for the behavior compared to the immediate antecedent stimulus. For indirect assessment, one of the biggest downfalls of indirect assessments is that interviews and other skills and questionnaires administered to the client or relevant other parties are heavily influenced by the client's communication limitations or parental bias. Sterling Turner and colleagues in their 2001 study outline this and also indicate that the retrospective teacher reports of behaviors can provide significant confounding variables to the results derived from indirect assessments, as such scales and questionnaires are relying on the responder to recall events in a objective and unbiased manner, which is difficult to expect of people that are not trained in more rigorous scientific methods. Scales and questionnaires often have a tendency to overlook behaviors, and in many cases, such measurements are not very comprehensive and overgeneralized behaviors. To that end, if we take a look at some of the questions asked, like, for example, by the problem behavior questionnaire, you can see that the problem behavior is measured in terms of specific situations that that seem to be more focused on academic levels, but may not be appropriate for all situations, or may provide some bias in the way that the questions are worded and cause further confounding variables. In addition, Wenzel, in his 2017 study, outlined that descriptive behavior assessments do not provide causational information about the functions of behaviors, but rather indicate more correlations. In this manner, the correlations would be weaker than causations and would be less reliable in terms of information. So in conclusion, descriptive functional behavior assessments do not provide causational information and can often be influenced very heavily by client or caregiver biases and limitations.
Am I still closing, or do you want me to go before you, LaTanya? Okay. While it may be true that many that functional behavior analysis cannot show causation, it has been shown specifically in a study by Alter and colleagues in 2008 that functional behavior assessments may not show causation, but they have a very accurate correlation. In their study, the results of their ABC assessment or their direct method agreed with the results of the functional analysis 100%. If for the most part it can be said that the results of direct methods of functional behavior assessments and functional analyses are comparable, then it would make sense and it would be wise for school districts to use direct assessments for the sake of time and resources. Also, many schools currently use indirect methods of functional behavior analysis when dealing with problem behavior. And with a shift towards more direct methods, teachers may find a noticeable difference in the effectiveness of their behavior support plans. That is all.
I'm sorry, I see what you're talking about. So, simply put, the key difference between experimental function analyses and functional behavior assessments is control. Control of the environment surrounding the target behavior. And in my opinion, it's best to have control over the environment, and that way you can prove direct correlation between the behavior and what causes it. That's it.
I just want to make sure we're good to stop the broadcast now.